Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the fascinating and honestly kind of messy early life of Benjamin Franklin. But we're not just going to tell you his story. We're going to let him do the talking, using his own words to look back on a life that he saw as a constant work in progress. And this quote, it tells you everything you need to know. Franklin literally saw his life as a book, a first draft. And like any good author, he knew it was filled with mistakes, or as he called them, errata, that he desperately wished he could fix in a second edition. And trust me, his early years were full of them. So our story doesn't start in Philadelphia, where you might think. Nope. It kicks off in Boston, with a young Ben Franklin who felt totally and completely trapped by the future everyone had planned for him. It's that classic story, right? A kid with huge dreams in a world that had much smaller plans. I mean, just look at this timeline. His path was all over the place. His dad, Josiah, had this big plan for him to join the church. But, well, school cost too much, so that dream got derailed. Instead of a life of study, young Ben found himself stuck in the family candle shop, a job he absolutely hated. His real passions, adventure on the high seas and devouring books, were putting him on a collision course with his family. So you've got this huge clash, right? On one side, his dad's very practical vision, a steady job, a stable life. On the other side, a kid who couldn't stand that life, who spent every single spare penny he had on books and stayed up all night reading them. This battle between duty and desire, it was going to define everything. So at 12, he's apprenticed to his older brother James, who's a printer, and Ben was great at it, a real natural. But the relationship was, let's just say, explosive. James had a temper, and Ben felt the constant beatings were huge injustice. But here's where it gets interesting. Ben starts secretly writing articles for his brother's newspaper, and they become a massive hit. When James finds out the star writer is his little brother, his pride is just shattered, and things between them got even worse. So how did he get out? Well, his escape came from this weird legal loophole. His brother James got thrown in jail for a bit, so to keep the paper running, they put it in Ben's name. That little move technically canceled his apprenticeship contract. So after one last blow-up, Ben just walked away. He knew it wasn't exactly fair, and years later, he'd look back on this as his first major errata. Okay, so picture this. He's just 17, a runaway apprentice with practically no money, and he shows up in New York, 300 miles from anyone he knows. No work there, so he keeps going, heading for Philadelphia. This is the city that's going to make him a legend. But his big entrance? Yeah, it was anything but grand. So you can just forget any glamorous image you have in your head. The journey was a nightmare. He got caught in a storm, was stuck on the water for 30 hours with no food, and then had to walk 50 miles in the pouring rain. By the time he finally stumbled onto the Market Street wharf on a Sunday morning, he was filthy, soaking wet, exhausted, and starving. So what does he have in his pockets? Get this. A single Dutch dollar and a handful of copper coins. That's it. That's his entire fortune. He even gives the copper coins to the guys on the boat, later writing that, a man is sometimes more generous when he has but a little money than when he has plenty. And this is the moment that becomes legendary. He walks up to a baker, asks for 3 penny worth of bread, and the baker hands him 3 giant, puffy rolls. He doesn't have room in his pockets, so he shoves one under each arm and starts munching on the third while walking up the street. And who just happens to be standing in a doorway, watching this whole ridiculous scene? His future wife, Deborah Reed. Talk about a first impression, huh? Despite that kind of silly start, Franklin's skill as a printer was undeniable. It got noticed, fast. So much so that he caught the eye of the most powerful man in the entire province, a man who was about to teach him a very, very hard lesson about trust. Yup, the governor himself, Sir William Keith, was super impressed. He saw this young guy with promising parts and made him an offer that must have sounded like an absolute dream come true. He, the governor, would personally finance Franklin's very own printing shop. The plan sounded incredible. Franklin would sail to London, pick out all the best equipment, and the governor would give him letters of credit to pay for the whole thing. For a poor kid who ran away from home, this was unbelievable. It was a golden ticket to the life he'd always dreamed of. Backed by the governor? What could possibly go wrong? Everything could go wrong. After weeks at sea, Franklin gets to London and starts sorting through the governor's bag of letters. He finds nothing, not a single one for him. And then the devastating truth hits him. Governor Keith had sent him on a complete fool's errand.
There were no letters of credit, there was no money, it was all a lie.
Stranded in London, Franklin was beyond furious. He quickly learned that Governor Keith had a reputation for making big promises he never, ever intended to keep. It was a brutal betrayal, but it was also a crucial life lesson. He had to rely on himself, on his own skills to survive. He got work in London's print shops and learned a harsh lesson about human nature he would never forget. So, you see, this whole wild journey, running away from home, getting betrayed by a governor, it was all part of what Franklin saw as the flawed first draft of his life. And what's so amazing is how he used these hard times to build his greatest strength, his ability to learn from his mistakes. You know, the term errata actually comes from the printing world. It's a list of typos and errors you find after a book has been printed. For Franklin, this was the perfect metaphor. His mistakes weren't things to be ashamed of or to hide. Nope. They were just errors in the first edition of his life that needed to be pointed out and corrected. And man, was he honest about them. He openly listed out his biggest screw-ups, breaking his contract, messing up a friend's money, and completely ghosting Deborah Reed while he was in London. He didn't just list these things to feel bad, he used them as his personal roadmap for how to become a better person. And that right there is the whole point. This process is what transformed the naive runaway kid into the wise, respected leader we remember today. His mistakes weren't failures that dragged him down. They were the raw material he used to literally invent himself. He was, in the truest sense of the word, a self-made man. So that's really the timeless lesson from Franklin's early life, isn't it? He reminds us that our mistakes don't have to define who we are. In fact, if we're honest and brave enough to face them, they can be the very things that refine us. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What faults would you put on your own list of errata?